Okay, hi everyone. Okay, I think we're gonna wait. We're still a bit early actually. And Julie, it's just hit 11:30 on my clock. And let's give people a minute or two to join. But we're now recording the session, so let's wait a little bit. Meanwhile, we were just talking about the weather earlier. So Anne is actually in Italy right now. Julie's in Bristol. I'm in London. And yeah, typical topic will be weather. Comparing, how good it is or bad it is wherever we are. I can see that people are starting to join, so that's great. Welcome everyone. We're just gonna give a minute or two for more people to join the session. They might just be coming from earlier ones, or maybe coming from the lounge where they've been networking with our other panelists from earlier sessions and from other tracks as well. Okay. So basically the format for this session will be Anne and Julie basically having a conversation. There's not going to be a lot of slides. There are no slides basically for this one. So it's going to be very interesting. We're going to be hearing obviously a lot of thoughts from Julie and Anne. I would encourage everyone, we're encouraging everyone to type in your questions in the chat box. We'll look out for these questions. And what we can do is not wait till the end to go through the questions. If there's something interesting that Anne sees or Julie sees or I see, then we'll just pick them and get them answered by our panelists, and the rest we can deal with at the end. If there are a lot of questions, we might not be able to go through all of them, but there's always an opportunity to network with Anne and Julie in the lounge after this particular session. Right, I'm not gonna take away too much time, take away too much time from our panelists. So I'm Jen Ashley, and I'm gonna hand over the floor to Anne Curry and Julie Pierce. Over to you, ladies.
Thank you very much. And if we just start off with some brief introductions. So I'm Julie Pierce. I'm from the UK Food Standards Agency. We are the government regulator responsible for ensuring the food that we eat in the UK is safe. It is what it says it is, so it is authentic, but becoming increasingly drawn into conversations around the sustainability of that food, food insecurity at a household and a national level, and being much more aware of the long-term destination of our food. So having said I work within the UK, also be mindful that half our food is imported. So we will always have an eye to the rest of the world. So within the FSA, I'm responsible for anything to do with data, digital, innovation, tech, and also all of our scientific research. That's me. Anne.
My name is Anne Curry. I've been in the tech industry as a very full-on techie for nearly 30 years now, working in various things. And these days, I'm on the leadership team of the Green Software Foundation, so the Linux Foundation, about how we make the tech industry, the code, a little bit greener. I'm also involved in a grid startup about how we make the grid more green. But I think the reason why Simon invited me to be talking on this particular topic is I'm also a science fiction writer, and I've written 7 novels, in the middle of writing novel 8 at the moment, and 3 of them were set in space. So 1 on the moon, 1 on Mars, and 1 going between the moon and Mars. And for that, I had to do an awful lot of research into what's going on in space and what's likely to go on to space. So that's my my contribution here. That's my angle that I'm interested in here. So Julie.
Great, thank you, Anne. And so if I just kick off with a little bit of theme setting. So we've been given the question as to how many people we think we should send into space. And we're going to try and explore who we might send, how many of them, as the question says. But as it's such a vast question, we've decided to narrow it down and look at it through the food lens. So that was the question, but what is the problem we're actually trying to solve here? So given the Earth is under so much pressure from climate change and other massive shocks that we've been seeing, particularly most recently, along with that population growth, what do we need to do to ensure that we can still feed ourselves and just survive? And that question is for all of us. It's the whole of the planet. So given what we're looking at the moment, and given everything that we hear on the news, and I think that abandoning this depleted Earth is looking increasingly attractive. It's all too hard here. So maybe we should head off and go and find our nirvana, or return to Eden, or just simply go to Mars. It might take a little bit of time to get there, but I think it's well worth thinking about that as an option. And we'll explore that proposal today, whether or not we should leave, or maybe whether we should stay. And we'll explore that through the mechanism of mapping. Now, Anne and I don't have a map prepared, and we won't be drawing one, but we will be thinking mapping as our technique to explore this challenge, and maybe give you some of the opportunity to see inside our heads as we draw our imaginary maps. So getting back to the question, why would we want to move away from home, from the Earth? So we know we need to increase the food that is available for consumption, given the globally increasing population. That increasing demand of food is expected to be of the order of 70%. So that is a big number. Now that's hard enough to consider just today, given the situation that we have today on how much food we produce and how well we do it. But I then start to look at climate change impacts on the food that we produce today, and whether or not we'll be able to still have the same yield levels. I also see population behaviour changing in response to lack of food and water, such as overall population migration or war. And then external to the food system, we've recently started to see impacts from other challenges like a lack of energy. So that lack of energy is already starting to affect the amount of fertilizer that's being produced to put on the soil, or it can affect our ability to process and manufacture the food or transport the food. So there are those externalities that are impacting the whole of the food system. And as I talk about this, I'm realizing I now need some sort of map, because I need to understand the context for this question, the interconnectivity of all of this, and also have a way to reflect that it isn't a static question with a static situation. So that's where I am starting to mull over all of this and thinking about what's happening here on Earth. So maybe I should ask Anne to introduce us to Mars and what that looks like. Anne.
Thank you very much. So when I started writing a book on living on Mars and how you'd live on Mars, I went into it thinking, oh yeah, Mars sounds great. I'm a bit of a Musk fan. I like a visionary thing. So one thing I like is a lot of stuff off to the left-hand side of the Wardley map. So things that are not even custom yet, things that are still in the heads. And there's a long way on the left-hand side of Wardley map. You've got stuff that's in the head of quite quite near future science fiction writers like me. So stuff that obeys the laws of physics. So it's possible. It's not being built, but it could be built. You could imagine how you would build it. And then I also like the kind of Star Trek stuff, which is mostly in the kind of fantasy level, or it doesn't even obey the laws of physics. So things like transporters and faster than light travel and gravity without spin and all that kind of stuff. That's all off in the far left-hand side of the Wardley map. So, but I live in the mildly to the left side of the Wardley map, and I was thinking, well, that's interesting. Then we can just rustle up a few inventions from that area and we'd all be quite happily living on Mars. But the interesting thing about once you start looking into Mars and the situation there is you realize that there's a whole area of debate, which is very interesting, very germane to living in space or living on Mars, which is what's going on to the right-hand side, beyond commodity on the Wardley map. So things that are so commoditized, are so that we just take for granted, that we don't even think. They're utterly so key. It's like fish that they've never heard of water. They're so key to our lives that we completely take them for granted. We don't even think about them. Things like air. And air is even air. So we tend to think, I'm rewatching at the moment the first series of the original Star Trek original series on Netflix, which is well worth watching because it's actually much better than I remember it being, and I remember it being very good. Things like they only talk about, oh, is it a breathable air? Does it have oxygen in it? But they don't talk about, yeah, but it might be all of those things, but it could still be vastly poisonous, as the air on Mars is. Vastly poisonous. Air pressure, is it an air pressure that we like on Earth, that we have on Earth, or is it a pressure which is so low it is beyond what's commonly called the Armstrong limits? And that's not after Neil Armstrong. That's a US Air Force chap who realized that you couldn't fly too close out, too high in the atmosphere, or basically your eyes popped out and all the oxygen started to come out of your bloodstream. If things are too low, if the air pressure is too low, that kills you very quickly. And Mars is well below the Armstrong limits. They would poison you and also kill you. It's not much better than a vacuum, really. So again, these are all things that on Earth we so take for granted we don't even think about them. We've got air, we've got breathable air, we've got air pressure. We've got gravity, which really we do need. It's quite handy. We've got a magnetosphere, which Mars doesn't have, which means that if you're on the surface of Mars, you're constantly being bombarded by solar radiation and you will die of cancer quite quickly. But all of that, oddly enough, is the quite easy stuff to handle, because that you can imagine there is stuff within the realms of physics. There are answers to those things. They're still speculative fiction. We have to entirely invent whole new areas of engineering to do it, but we can at least imagine vaguely. You could create an artificial. People are talking about the idea of artificial magnetospheres using big magnets, even planet-sized ones. But let's face it, that's decades, if not a century, or if not centuries off. You can wear a spacesuit and everything to protect you from vacuum or poison or whatever else. But on top of that, you've got things like biomes. I don't know if any of you have read any. This takes us out of science fiction and into biology. If anybody's read any E.O. Wilson, the guy who came up with the idea of the half-Earth theory, in one of his later books, he died quite recently, I think. In one of his later books, he talked about how, forget what you see on Star Trek. The likelihood is you are not going to be able to set foot onto a planet that has any life on it whatsoever and have that life be anything other than utterly inimical to you as a human, because we take biomes for granted. But there were, back in the 3.5 billion years ago, there were a lot of ways that biology could have developed. Thousands, millions of ways that biology could have developed. once it develops one way, then everything rolls on from that. You are completely dependent upon those early, there were loads of choices there, but you're completely dependent on the plants, the bacteria in the air, everything follows from those early random decisions in biome. And there's really, unless we're all Fred Hoyle fans and we believe in panspermia, the life from one planet has seeded all the planets. That's the only way that we're all going to have a compatible biome. Otherwise, yeah, Star Trek is not a plausible thing. We will not be able to land on other planets that have life, because that life will not be compatible with us. So all of these things, the biome, the magnetosphere, gravity, air, they're all off to the right of a Wardley map, but they're utterly, utterly fundamental when it comes to going into space. And Mars does not have a lot of those things. Anyway, so Julie.
Thank you, Anne, for selling Mars in such a positive way. You clearly have a role in real estate. So as I listened to you there wasn't a lot that when I was thinking, yes, that sounds like a positive, and we didn't even touch on the sort of how much it would cost to get there, and the investment we would have to make to get there and establish a whole population out there. So listening to you there makes me think, maybe I should start to look back at Earth, and start to sort of think through a little bit more about whether that option might fly at all in being able to feed ourselves. So as I say, we're under huge pressure to feed the population already, and with a challenge, but only 70% more than we have at the moment. So it's not a huge number. We're not talking about some of the numbers you've been talking about. You know, I'm talking about doubling rather than multiplying by orders of magnitude in some of these challenges. So I'm feeling a bit reassured that maybe it might be possible. And then when I start to look into the food system, even how it works at the moment, I see that the UN said relatively recently that 1/3 of the food is wasted. So we're producing all this food, we're growing it, we're manufacturing it, we're transporting it across the oceans, but overall 1/3 of it is just wasted. So that of that 1/3, about half is wasted sort of upstream in farming, in agriculture itself, and the other half is wasted downstream by the retailers and also all of us consumers. We manage to waste a huge amount of food. So again, given that I'm trying to get an additional 70%, I do wonder whether reducing that 30% of waste, that should be a relatively easy target. So maybe I need to think more about what is actually going on through the whole of the end-to-end food system. And then also trying to think about how I might apply some of the innovation, all of those great minds and all of those people who might be thinking about going to Mars. If I could take all of that intellect and all of that funding, I'm likely to get all of it, but some of it, just bring some of that human ingenuity and resource and start to use that to think, how else might I address the gap? So even thinking about things I already know about meat using 17 times as much land as arable to produce protein. And I'm not advocating a completely meat-free diet, and we need to understand the nuances of where livestock make most sense and where they don't across the planet. But even at that headline level, those numbers say, oh, if I could release that land to grow more food, that would help. Maybe I can use the technology itself, precision farming, better breeding of both plants and animals. And I think also thinking about getting people to engage properly with this subject, because it is really becoming a matter of life and death. So maybe there is something to go after in there. But also, just going back to the map that you were drawing there, as saying it's sort of is split between either side of the map. It's sort of on and off, and I think it's great to see that map being played out, because as I take that sort of view of Mars and start to extend the thinking that we have down here on Earth, I think we do need to be better at mapping and thinking and pushing a little bit further out, and being better at understanding that context. And that context extends out into, as I said earlier, things like energy supply. We need to be much better, more aware of what is going on out there, those bigger influences. We need to be much better at understanding people, their behavior, their attitudes, their culture, what they will eat, what they don't want to eat. That behavior is really, really powerful, and we need to galvanize and understand people, and they need to be better understood on the map. And also people, you talked about the biome and maybe the big macrobiome, and I'm going to talk about the microbiome of what goes on in your gut. We really need to understand how people process food and what makes it relevant to them, and how it will keep them healthy. So I think my final sort of thought in this mapping space is, we talk about food, and every now and then we talk about the food system, and it's a bit of a throwaway comment, but I think we need to make our understanding of the food system real, and we need to be much better at mapping the system, understanding and mapping the linkages between the various companies, the nations that export and import food, and all of the other influences. So having that much better understanding of how it is all joined up, and with the data that makes sense of it all, maybe we should be investing in those areas as a starter for 10. I don't know what you think.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I think so. I think you draw the fundamentally, as you say, it's 70% is doable, and it's 70% of change that is inside a Wardley map, not outside a Wardley map. Really, I mean, it feels like we're slightly making the decision as, do people envisage what's the worst future? Eating a bit more hummus, or living your entire life in a post-apocalyptic style bunker on Mars? It's there is, and the thing is, it's not even that, because we all know that inside that all in order to support life these days, in order to support a life off planet, you would need to still have most of humanity operating inside a Wardley map, in that you'd still need the industry, the technology, the developments, the commoditization that was going on, that happens on Earth but does not happen anywhere else. There is, at the moment, we have no industry going on in space. Maybe at some point we'll have terraformed the back of the moon into we'll have a nice facing the natural park moon, which is the bit that we see. The dark side of the moon will just be entirely factories, possibly, and mining operations. But that, again, is not going to happen for decades, if not centuries. And until we get that, we won't have the backup for working off planet, really, for supporting us in any kind of likely livable lifestyle off planet. So yeah, space is just not really an option. It's like, just, take that off the table. It's not an option. We're going to have to when we talk about there is no planet B, I would say it's not really about the resources and, you know, we use 6 times whatever, because as you say, that's less than 10x. It can be solved with technology and some, you know, good commoditization gets you 10x. But there's no planet B, because there is literally no other planets that we can live on because our biome says no, almost certainly. But yeah, I know. And I love space. I'm a science fiction writer in space.
So I think there have been some comments in the chat about maybe viewing Earth as that spaceship, for those of us who were brought up on Star Trek, and maybe that might be a positive analogy for those of us thinking that way. But maybe the message is as much around understanding it, valuing it, understanding how it all works together. So maybe that's part of the analogy, and maybe a lot that we can do in that. And if we get the whole of the Star Trek team to all engage and all pull in the same direction, maybe that will also very much help us with really good, strong leadership from a Captain Kirk. That would be great too. But there was a question in the chat, maybe about, before we head off all the way to Mars, is there anything that we could do as a sort of like a step before going all of that way, maybe having some sort of spaceships or sort of artificial satellites outside and beyond the Earth? Could we do that, and would it be worth doing?
Yeah, I mean, there is good stuff you can do. I'm quite interested in space-based solar power, which there's a lot of work going on about having capturing sunlight, solar power off either in low Earth or even in orbit around the moon, various places that you can potentially have that and then beam it back to Earth, because there you've got 100% light. You know, as long as you go far enough out, you've got put your satellites in the right place, then you've got light all the time. And I think China are looking into that, India are looking into that, even the EU is looking into that. So there's loads, and NASA have their finger in all these pies, although NASA tend to not be all that good. They spend a lot of money, don't necessarily get an awful lot done generally. But yeah, so there's loads of stuff that can happen in space. So Musk's very fond of Mars, but I feel from what I looked into it that Mars is a bit of a non-starter, because as it's poisonous, you don't really get any benefit from having an atmosphere, and it actually is in many ways worse than being in a full vacuum. And you also have a gravity well that you're then stuck in, but not a decent amount of gravity that won't kind of cause all your bones to waste away and stuff. So Mars, I would say, is not a great place, but the moon. There's tons of interesting physics that you can do on the moon, loads of interesting logistical stuff that you can do on the moon. And it's you know, it's like it's in our neighborhood. And a lot of the work, Musk is doing great work on turning launches, satellite launches and off planets, getting stuff out of the gravity well into a commodity. Although in the long run, we might need a space elevator if we're going to really make Mars into a complete and total industrial moon base, which would all be underground. So yeah. So the moon's a good option. Space-based solar power, fantastic.
So the moon's a good option, and for the power, and as I said, I think it's dawned on us more recently, many of us might have realized, but it's becoming clearer as to the importance of energy to things like food. So it wouldn't look like energy was directly required to produce the food we eat, but it is hugely important. So again, if we can just get access to infinite amounts of energy, what might we be able to do with the production of food on Earth? That might be our silver bullet. So again, very much worth exploring again some of those externalities that we might have around our more conventional map.
Yeah, it's interesting when you start looking into this and you think, I think that Musk is motivated by something that actually Ian Banks used to say, very, very good science fiction writer, a jolly nice chap as well, I believe. Used to say that, you know, something happens to Earth and we're all gone. We need a backup. We need Earth. We need humans existing somewhere else off Earth. But ironically, I just don't think that Mars is that place, because it's easier. It would be easier to survive underground or at the bottom of the sea on Earth than it would be to survive on Mars. So fundamentally, if we really want to do that, and maybe he is, it wouldn't surprise me for all the stuff if Musk isn't using his giant boring company to create a huge underground bunker somewhere, then I'd be surprised, because that's relatively cheap, and you'd want to keep it secret. So he's running it, and he's not telling me. Oh, the other thing I think is probably every time I think about, Starlink's great, it's absolutely fantastic, but the issue is always, you know, how much stuff can we put up there before we end up with a kind of Kessler effect, which is and for those of you who don't constantly read science fiction, Kessler effect is where you get all your space debris building up a giant, crashing into one another and building up a giant effectively layer that locks you into the Earth. Now, one of the interesting things about the at low Earth orbit is theoretically it can't cause a Kessler effect, because eventually all that stuff would just run out of juice and drop to the Earth. But it would take a couple of decades for that to happen. And I always wonder with if I was Musk, if I was setting up a Mars base, I would definitely want a way of being able to lock everybody into the Earth for a couple of decades if I needed to, if they all started behaving too badly, to let my Mars base. But he's wrong on that, because really Mars will require Earth. if he triggers Kessler effect for 2 decades to give Mars a bit of a shot, they're all dead. I don't think we can operate in space without at the moment, the massive industrial base on Earth. So we'd have to, we need the industrial base on the moon before we can start, I would say.
I was just wondering whether, just again, picking up on one of the questions or comments in the chat, was to sort of turn it on its head and move away from the technology, and pick up on one of the comments about consumers and consumerism, because I also think that is as powerful as any of these technologies that you were talking about, and certainly at the FSA, much of our legislation actually talks about consumers, because consumers are us and we eat food, and that's why we're here. We're about people eating food rather than anything else. But we're also very mindful of the phrase, what it means, what it implies, our relationship with business and also other people. And wherever we can, we're increasingly starting to try to use other words like people, citizens, the population, depending on what is most appropriate. But sort of doing our little bit to try and move away from that consumer, that passive consumerism approach, with no agency, and with everything else that it is bringing. And we haven't particularly talked about nutrition and what we're doing to ourselves today, but I think that is also going to be really important to us as to how we engage better and have citizens having these conversations, not passive consumers.
Well, I remember that almost the first thing you said to me on this topic when we first started talking about it was the future is chickpeas.
Yep. What's not to like? The future is chickpeas. And also having dismissed consumerism and everything else, I would also like to salvage marketing, because I think, unfortunately, human beings at the end of the day are still prone to a bit of marketing. And if there's anything we can do to make chickpeas sexy, make it the thing of the moment, make it a fashion, then we all head off and start eating chickpeas. So it isn't. It is powerful, and again, it comes back to understanding humans and how they operate and how they're motivated. That is also as powerful as anything else.
Well, because I mean, you were saying that yeah, again, in our first conversation, you said that what on earth are we doing? Constantly talking about selling fake meat as an idea, when in fact we have vastly better alternatives.
Yeah. Yes, we as you look about the production of meat and even alternative protein and trying to persuade us to eat insects and all of those sorts of things. Again, they're innovations and they're great ideas. Excellent, Chris. You're with me there on chickpeas. Other pulses are available. But the waste of the production and the multi-levels of production to produce something that we think we want. So we think we want a burger and we think it needs to look like it is bleeding because it is meant to be a raw burger, even though that sets me on edge. I'm talking about food safety. That is not a good thing. Don't go there. But I think that whole relationship between people and food, not only here in the UK but across the world, is so complex and it is so deep to our individual being, to our families, to our cultures, to our religions. So again, I think it's well worth exploring and researching that behavior and what makes us tick.
Well, I mean, non-dairy milks is very interesting because obviously that's I'm not a vegan, but you know, I bet eventually we're all going to be vegans. But I'm not a vegan, and that'll be fine, totally fine. And I already have mostly dairy milk, but non-dairy milk. But one of the interesting things about it, because I also read some stuff about the future of food and things like that, is that dairy milks and non-dairy milks are very artificial, and a lot of vegan stuff, like fake meat, is very, very artificial, when in fact ordinary foods taste quite nice, but they do take a lot of time to prepare. So it's convenience, isn't it? Fake meat and fake cheese and all that kind of stuff. They're more convenient than
unfortunately, they are more convenient and they are often cheaper. So even with high processing, so you'd think a lot of investment in that processing should cost, and you would then see that cost passed on to the consumer. Amazingly, it doesn't work like that, and they end up by being cheaper. So again, I think we need to sort of explore what is going on. And indeed, in talking about convenience, we need to put a value on that. What does convenience mean? If nothing else, it means time. What is the value of time? How much time do we have? Are we properly factoring that in? But I'm getting a lot of support for the non-meat lobby. Having said that, at the FSA, we do not take a position on meat or not meat, but maybe just slightly less meat than we consume at the moment. And again, we don't have to stop eating meat. You know, how far could we go if we only ate good meat once a week?
Well, it's interesting that in tech, if we'd consider a 10x improvement to be a really significant improvement. And we always talk about meat, and people assume that poultry is included in that, but actually poultry is 1/10 the impact of beef. And so a move from beef to chicken really isn't that much of a move, you know, to get a big benefit.
Well, it is fine as long as we can handle the disease risk. So when we're thinking about what we're doing in introducing avian influenza through intensive farming and increase in zoonotic diseases, so even I think all of these foods would continue to have a risk associated with them. So we wouldn't do one thing and then we're done. I think that's the other takeaway. We would have to be really actively planning, monitoring, managing the whole of our food system. Even back here on this new Eden I just created back here on Earth.
Yeah, well, actually, we've only got 5 minutes left, but actually, that is a very good point. In that, coronavirus probably didn't do any great service to the BAT marketing board, but the next one is almost certainly going to be avian. I mean, this avian flu has already jumped mammals, hasn't it? And it's so fundamentally, it's going to be the next big pandemic. We just have to hope that they're already developing a vaccine for it. So hopefully we'll have it by the time it arrives. But as you say, it probably won't do. If it's a nasty pandemic, the next one, possibly even worse than coronavirus, it's not going to do the chicken marketing board very much good.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, and yeah, you're right. There's only 5 minutes left. There's been an interesting exchange in the chat window. Actually, it's all about food, and I think our audience is getting hungry now. But it's good that lunchtime is coming up, at least in the UK. So yeah, I mean, are there any more questions maybe from the audience that you'd like to ask our panelists before we're not wrapping up yet? We have around 5 minutes, so feel free to type in your questions. But back to you, Anne and Julie.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how I think I was here to say no to space, and I think that I have said no. Do not imagine that space you'd have to be a total idiot to think that space was a plausible lifestyle alternative. The whole Elysium thing, that's a lot further off than you can possibly imagine. You'd be much better off living in an undersea city. An undersea city, that's a more plausible. At least you'd be able to see out the window. It'd be something nice.
So hopefully I've recruited everybody to the cause to keep Earth both beautiful and productive. That was definitely my intention, and I think it's really for all of us to really sort of get active, get our hands dirty in the soil, and try and ensure that we can deliver on that.
There's a question from Simon Wardley, actually. How do we persuade Elon Musk that Mars should not be our destination? That's probably going to be difficult.
Well, he can read one of my books.
If he goes, I think we're not too bothered if he goes on his own. That wasn't the ask. We were talking about sort of the whole population. So we're quite happy to sort of let a few individuals head off to wherever. If that helps answer the question.
Yeah, and you can actually read my book number 5, Mars Insurgents, which you would actually quite enjoy because he is quite techie.
Okay, I don't think Twitter bots will do the job with Musk. Someone said, who said that? That was Jonathan. Yeah, I wish we can solve things via Twitter bots, but that's not going to happen. Oh, there's another question that's popping up. Who is this? Sam was saying, I'm not convinced Elon actually wants to go to Mars in the medium term. I suspect it is a ploy to generate demand for space mining and production. What do you think?
That might be true, because otherwise it doesn't really make any sense. It really doesn't make any sense. But space mining and production, that makes perfect sense. That will definitely happen.
Okay, just checking if there are any more questions. If not, I think we will wrap up. Thank you, Julie and Anne. I know you two have been involved with MapCamp for a few years now, like I've been. So I started co-chairing this with Simon back in 2017. And I know I've seen you both around over the years, so thanks for that. And we obviously would like to see you in the next few years. And as I mentioned in our earlier session before this one, we encourage people who have not maybe spoken at MapCamp before, if you've got like ideas that you want to put through to the organizing team and be one of the speakers in the future. Yeah, we encourage that. So we had one person like that earlier who attended in person and then attended virtually last year, and now he's a speaker for this year. So that's great. Simon, it's Simon. I forgot his surname now. It starts with a W. Not Wordley, but another
Name
S.
before. I'm sure I've
Yeah.
heard that name before. Simon Wardley.
Okay. Do you have anything else you want to maybe leave our audience with, Julie and Anne, before we wrap up?
No, just thank you very much. Thank you for listening, and thanks for some great questions from me. Anne, anything you want to say?
Well, actually, I've been inspired by Jen there to say that I'm one of the community chairs for the Green Software Foundation, and we are always looking for speakers on green subjects, green technology, green anything. So I'm on Twitter, give me a buzz. Even if you've never had any experience before, always looking for speakers for meetups and conferences and that kind of thing.
Okay. The last comment from Chris Ford. Simon's current plans seem to be to have many cities underwater already. I'm not sure what that's in reference to, but yeah. Okay, thanks for that, Chris. And with that, I will end the session. And as I said, I'm encouraging everyone to go and join us in the lounge. Our panelists, are going to be there. Mingling with people, and you can ask further questions over there. And we'll see you at the tracks for this afternoon. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.